Trump has said he's going to do some wonderful things. He's going to cut taxes, which is always great for any society, any country. He said he's going to rebuild the infrastructure, which America desperately needs and is good for America. He says he's going to bring home the $3 trillion U.S. dollars, which American companies have overseas. All of these things are wonderful, wonderful things. And if he can do it, wow, things are going to be great. But Mr. Trump has also said he's going to have trade war with China, Mexico, Japan, Korea, a few other people that he has named. He swore that on his first day in office, he would impose 45% tariffs against China. Well, he's been there 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and he hasn't done it yet, but he's still got it in his head, I'm sure. Maybe he's just another politician like all the rest of them. He says one thing, it doesn't mean it at all, but he does have at least 3 people in high levels in his group who are very, very keen to have trade wars with China and other people. If he does that, Eric, it's all over. I mean, history is very clear that trade wars always lead to problems, often to disaster, sometimes even to real war, shooting war. So I don't know. I'm not sure Mr. Trump knows. He said so many things, and many of the things are contradictory. Now, if he's not going to have trade wars with various people, then chances are for a while, happy days are here. Well, I still own the dollar. The dollar, fortunately, is having a correction now. You know, all bull markets need corrections. Corrections are good. I haven't sold any. I may have even bought more for all I know. No, I still see the same thing, that whatever happens in the world, there is going to be some turmoil somewhere along the line. We're already seeing it in some places. The euro is still having its own version of turmoil and is going to have a lot more this year. So the dollar is going to be, quote, a safe haven. As we discussed last year, Eric, it is not a safe haven, but it is perceived as a safe haven. And in fact, for some countries, it is a safe haven compared to, say, the euro or other currencies. So I still own the dollar. The fundamentals have only gotten worse, but the fundamentals have gotten worse everywhere, except maybe Russia. So I still own the U.S. dollar. I've been around long enough to know that anything is possible, no matter how weird it may sound. In fact, the weirder it sounds, the more likely it's probably going to happen. I doubt if it's going to be a Plaza Accord this time around. It's more likely that the dollar is going to go higher and higher on its own volition for some of the reasons we discussed. It will get too high. It will cause serious credit problems for some people, because I got a lot of people that borrowed a lot of dollars. It will also make many American companies less competitive. So it's going to go too high, may turn into a bubble, at which point I hope I'm smart enough to sell it, because at some point market forces are going to cause the dollar to come back down, because people are going to realize, oh my gosh, this is causing a lot of turmoil, economic problems in the world, and it's damaging the American economy. At that point, the smart guys will get out, and I hope I'm one of them. Well, if it turns into a bubble, all bubbles look the same, no matter what country, what period of history, what assets. You know, everybody's screaming to buy it. They're screaming that it's different this time. You don't understand. You old man, you just cannot understand why everybody needs to own dollars. So the signs will always be there. Signs along the way will be some of the things I mentioned. You will start seeing bankruptcies by companies or countries that are overextended in U.S. dollars, and since the dollar is going higher, they cannot repay their debts. You will see American companies and American balance of trade getting worse because of the high dollar. The signs will be pretty clear. They're pretty simple signs. They've been around for hundreds of years, thousands of years. I just hope I'm smart enough to recognize them and have the insight to interpret them properly. Well, all those guys are smarter than I am, so I don't know. I, anyway, am not short bonds at the moment. Certainly would have been a good trade last summer. As you pointed out, the bonds made a high, or interest rates made a low, long-term rates made a low. They have rallied since, but for my money right now, as we speak, here in February of 2017, everybody is bullish on long-term U.S. government bonds. I've been around long enough, Eric, to know that when everybody's on the same side of the boat, I better run to the other side. So I am not shorting government bonds. I am short junk bonds still. If and when the mood changes and people are less skeptical, if bonds go down and everybody starts saying, oh, bonds cheated me, she lied to me, they lied, then I might be ready to short bonds again, because we're certainly in the process of making a top. When that top comes, I don't know. I'm smart. I'm a very, very, very bad market timer, as you know. I'm a very, very bad short-term trader, so you should ask those other guys to get your timing. Well, I happen to agree with you 100%. The very fact that I'm still short junk bonds, it means it's definitely the timing is wrong. I know when interest rates start going up again permanently, when the bull market really does come to an end in interest rates, government bonds, interest rates are going to go very, very high, Eric, very high. If I told you how high, you would probably hang up now and not listen to me anymore. But in 1981, short-term interest rates in America were over 20%. Long-term bonds were yielding over 15%. We've had these long bull and bear markets in bonds in the United States, and we probably will again. So when interest rates go higher, the junk bonds are going to get destroyed, both by interest rates and by credit defaults, because many of them are, in fact, junk. The companies are not great credit risk, and they're gonna pay the price. I'm sorry, why do you think governments cannot go bankrupt? It's happened throughout history. The norm is for governments to go bankrupt over any extended periods of time, including the countries which are on top. After the First World War, 100 years ago, the UK was the richest, most powerful country in the world. There was no number two. Well, I can remember when the UK went bankrupt in the night, 3 generations later. Could not sell long-term debt. The IMF had to bail them out. You're not old enough to remember when the French were like that, or the Spanish, or the Dutch. Everybody has been on top. Well, not everybody, but many people have been on top one time or another. They've all gone bankrupt. Why do you think people cannot go bankrupt? Well, Eric, I suggest that you do a little more research, although I don't think you need to, because you're very knowledgeable. But if you do a lot of research and become knowledgeable about what's going on in the world, you're going to get very, very worried. And if you get very, very worried, you're going to, I hope, get prepared, because we're going to have the worst economic problems we've had in your lifetime or my lifetime. And when that happens, a lot of people are going to disappear. In 2008, Bear Stearns disappeared. Bear Stearns had been around over 90 years. Lehman Brothers disappeared. Lehman Brothers has been around over 150 years. A long, long time, a long, glorious history. Been through wars, depression, civil war. They've been through everything, and yet they disappeared. So the next time around, it's going to be worse than anything we've seen, and a lot of institutions, people, companies, even countries, certainly governments, and maybe even countries are going to disappear. I hope you get very worried. Well, let's just talk about some of the things going to happen in the next couple of years, and then I think we can draw further conclusions. There are going to be more movements in Europe, for instance, for countries to split up and for countries to leave the EU. You mentioned France before. There are people in France who want to split the country. There are people in Italy, Spain, Belgium who want to split those countries. They are now going to be encouraged by the fact that Brexit was successful. The Scots are going to have another election about the possibility of leaving the UK. Whether these things happen or not, Eric, I don't know yet. I have views, but who cares? But we're certainly going to have the ongoing turmoil that these movements are alive and well and will be very active and vocal and visible for a while. Now, let's presume for a moment that some of them are successful. Well, if the European Union starts breaking up or the euro starts breaking up, that's going to throw a spanner in a lot of people's works, because nobody's really sort of planned on that. most of the bonds, the euro bonds, none of them, very few of them now, have any provision for what happens if there is no euro. I mean, Italy owns several $billion worth of bonds. Suppose Italy pulls out of the euro and they suddenly say, okay, we're going to pay you back in lira. Well, that's going to confuse a lot of people and cause a lot more turmoil. You have the same sorts of movements in Asia, not nearly as powerful or as vocal yet, but you have the same sorts of in the United States. There's a movement now for California to withdraw from the U.S. And by the way, in the U.S., there are a lot of people who would like to see California leave the U.S. So it may work. It may work both ways. So when you start having bear markets, as you, I'm sure, well know, if one bad thing's happened, then another bad thing happens, and these things snowball. Just like in bull markets, good news comes out, then more good news comes out. And the next thing you know, you're 5 or 6 or 7 years into a bull market. Well, bear markets do the same thing. And so we have a lot of bad news on the horizon. I haven't even gotten to war. I haven't even gotten to trade war or anything like that. But, you know, things do go wrong. Whenever things are soft or bad and things are going wrong, people look for somebody to blame. They always, throughout history, wherever we are, whichever country we're discussing, the first people blamed are always the foreigners. They have different color skin, different languages, different religions, different food. They smell bad. Their food smells bad. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard people talk about how, oh, those people, their food smells bad, and they smell bad too. So it's very easy. It's always happened that way to blame the foreigners. For better or for worse, it seems it is happening, as you point out, in the U.S. again, but it's also happening in other places, Germany, France, Italy, many places. They're blaming the foreigners already again. It's even happening in Singapore to some extent where I live, nothing like in Europe at the moment. And as you rile up against the foreigners, most countries historically have closed off one way or the other. They close their borders, they close their economies. And when you close the economy, it leads to economic problems. And sometimes eventually, if you get into real serious trade wars, it leads to bankruptcy and even worse. You know, it's rare, I don't think ever in history, that one country has started a trade war and the other country says, oh, well, that's too bad. Well, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to sit here and let you hit us again and again and again. No, the other countries retaliate. That's the way human beings are. So if country X starts a trade war, then country Y hits back. And then country X hits back, and country Y hits back. And the next thing you know, countries C and D and E are involved as well. And everybody's suffering. And then as economies get worse, more and more things happen, more and more discrimination, more and more blame, and then eventually bullets start flying. So no, I don't like at all what I see happening. There are many analogies to previous periods in history. Before the First World War, this sort of thing started happening, and certainly before the Second World War, this sort of thing started happening. It's been common throughout history, and these wars, you know, when they start, they usually, in 1914, nobody could conceive of war, and then the next thing you knew, there was war, and everybody said, "Don't worry, it'll be over by Christmas." Well, 6 months later, everybody was saying, "How do we get into this war? How do we get out of this war? It's absurd. It's ludicrous, etc." And that's been the case for most wars. If you go back and look, some bureaucrat throws his weight around. The next thing you know, another bureaucrat throws his weight around. And the next thing you know, 20-year-old kids are shooting at each other instead of drinking beer together. And everybody's suffering. So no, am I worried? I'm very worried. And I know enough history to know that these things have often led to real war. Certainly, you know, we just had a president who won the Nobel Peace Prize, of all things. Well, he started more wars probably than most presidents in American history. America seems to have a penchant for war, and they seem to like to get involved. Well, I do know that during the last administration, Mr. Obama's administration, as you probably remember, we tried to pull off an illegal coup in Ukraine. You know, we got caught at it. What's her name? Victoria Lundgren, whatever the woman's name in the State Department. There are several pieces of evidence where we know she tried to instigate an illegal coup. Then, of course, the Russians outsmarted us. And so the State Department started blaming it on the Russians. And the hype against the Russians has gotten bigger and bigger ever since, after we tried to instigate the illegal coup in Crimea and Ukraine. So yes, we are certainly at fault to some extent, and obviously when you're caught, you got to keep the rhetoric up and keep throwing more and more accusations, and so the State Department has done that. I know that before that illegal coup, Obama, Bush, everybody was trying to be friends with the Russians, rightly so. The Cold War had ended long ago. The Russians wanted to be friends with America. We didn't need NATO anymore. Who needed the Cold War, et cetera? All the money we were spending on some of these arms manufacturers and soldiers.